And thank you to all of you who are joining this webinar today. My name is Roel Seibing. I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Global Communications in Doshisha University in Kyoto, Japan, and also a ATLAS.ti senior trainer, which brings me to hosting this webinar on behalf of the International Qualitative Research Network. And today we have a fascinating discussion about engaging in technological reflexivity and deciding whether and how to use ATLAS.ti from a pair of presenters that I'll introduce to all of you now. And so our first presenter, Trina M. Paulus, PhD, is a professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at East Tennessee State University and a senior trainer for ATLAS.ti. She is the co-author of 3 books, including Doing Qualitative Research in a Digital World, Looking for Insight, Transformation, and Learning in Online Talk, and Digital Tools for Qualitative Research. And her co-presenter is Jessica Nina Lester, PhD. She is a professor of qualitative methodology in the School of Education at Indiana University at Bloomington. Having been trained in cultural studies and qualitative research methodology, she takes an interdisciplinary approach to her scholarship, including both the methodological and substantive foci of her research program. Throughout the webinar, if you have any questions as you are watching their presentation, please feel free to ask a question through the Q&A tool that is at the bottom of the Zoho toolbar, represented by a speak out icon with the question mark. And in the last bits of our webinar, I will be happy to field questions to them in the order that we receive them. But without further ado, I will leave it to Trina and Jessica. Take it away, please.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you all today virtually to really think through some new ideas for Jessica and I related to ATLAS.ti, qualitative data analysis software, and methodology. So what we're going to try to cover is first to set the groundwork or the framework in terms of what we're talking about when we talk about reflexivity, especially technological reflexivity, what we mean by a research workflow, what we mean by the consequences. And then once we establish that kind of background, we're going to walk through 4 different workflows showing how we think about engaging with ATLAS.ti as the hub for various methodological workflows. And we're going to kind of go back and forth on this. Jessica will talk a little bit about literature review workflows. I will talk about social media as a data source workflow. Jessica will talk about transcription workflows, and I will talk about data analysis workflows and also touch a bit on the new AI tools that ATLAS.ti offers and how those are impacting our workflow. And then, of course, we're planning on leaving plenty of time for question and answer, comments, feedback that you might have for us. So just to start, especially since the pandemic, and of course, even before, much of our social life is now conducted online. As qualitative researchers, we all study the human experience. So of course, we need to be studying the online spaces and digital tools that we use to live our lives these days. So as researchers who study human life, we need to be studying what happens in these online spaces. And as we all realized since 2020, if not before, we need new digital tools and spaces in which to do that. But creating digital research workflows, creating ways to do research with new tools, to try to do that equitably and in relevant ways, these can create methodological, ethical, and technological dilemmas for us as we move into this space. So we argue that encouraging researchers to engage in technologically reflexive conversations around these choices to embrace the digital, make the dilemmas as well as our decisions and the consequences more visible and available to inquiry by ourselves and also the people who are participating in our research studies and the people that are consuming our research findings. So just to define a few key terms so that we can kind of all be on the same page, this was a definition that we offered in our book, Doing Qualitative Research in a Digital World. Reflexivity is, of course, a topic that's discussed quite extensively in the qualitative research methodological literature, but we've really noticed that technology choices are less frequently included in these discussions. So we think of reflexivity as a process of intentionally attending to the perspectives, attitudes, and beliefs that shape research design decisions and meaning making, including the use of technology. So at this point in time as researchers, we know that whether it's deciding to use FaceTime to do interviews, or use Reddit as a source of qualitative data, or to use ATLAS.ti as a platform for conducting data management and analysis, we do need to consider the potential and actual intended and unintended consequences of the choices in a reflexive way. So in terms of defining what we mean by reflexive digital research workflows, this is our working definition, and we look forward to feedback from everyone on this, because again, this is very much sort of our thinking in progress. We think of this as a research design that aligns methodologies and technologies in a coherent manner, that intentionally considers the role of digital tools and spaces, and strives to acknowledge the intentional and unintentional, and I would add both positive and negative consequences of the decisions that we're making. So the ideas that we're going to talk about today do come from the book that was published by Sage in 2022, and we've been continuing to work on these ideas since then. In the book, we offered these 9 research design considerations that we think all researchers are or should be engaging in discussions and thinking around, and that these considerations are ideally driven by both theory and methodological choices. And so through each chapter of the book, then, we're illustrating how these considerations have specific relationships with digital tools and spaces. So for example, how is it that new technologies may impact where we do our research and who our participants can be? And that would be consideration number 4. How do technology choices impact the overall quality of our research findings? Consideration 8. And the overall ethics of the study, and that's consideration number 9. Each of the design considerations can be enacted as part of their own digital research workflow, or possibly a very large digital workflow that encompasses all phases of the research process. But our main argument is that the workflows have to be conceptually and methodologically driven, and they may well look different for each researcher and for each study. So engaging the literature, selecting sites and participants, generating data, transcribing and analyzing data, representing and sharing findings, each of these phases of the research process can be done using digital tools and spaces to varying degrees. More importantly, each decision around whether or not and how to use the spaces and tools to create these workflows do come with the consequences, and that, again, highlights the importance of reflexivity. So today is kind of our first chance to talk about ATLAS.ti specifically, or any qualitative data analysis software platform, and how that fits into our overall thinking around reflexive digital research workflows. And we're excited to be here talking specifically to this community, because we've both been trainers for ATLAS.ti over the years and have used it extensively. And for years, we've been talking about the potential for platforms like ATLAS.ti to actually serve as what we call the hub for digital qualitative research workflows. They are not just for data analysis, as those of you who already use the platform know. They're great for storing and organizing data, visualizing data, and sharing findings. And we've noticed ourselves over the years that that kind of stance about the usefulness of the tool has become more evident in ATLAS.ti's own website and own promotional materials, that there's a lot of different ways that the tool can be part of this overall workflow. So while in our earlier work, we used to be very focused on convincing our skeptical colleagues that the somewhat heavy lift of adopting qualitative data analysis software was indeed worth it, because it could serve as the hub for the entire research project. And this screenshot was part of one of our standard presentations to faculty, colleagues, and students about everything that ATLAS.ti can support and why we should consider adopting it. We've kind of shifted away from trying to convince people of the utility value of it, to really focusing on the what happens if and when we do adopt the software. And that's where our most current thinking really resides. So this is from our most recent publication that is our first time really writing about the consequences of generating digital research workflows. So we've offered this heuristic in Table 1 of our paper in International Journal of Social Research Methodology to try to help scholars think through reflexively these 4 consequence categories. So first, adopting a digital workflow will impact how we enact our methods. That is, we have to ask ourselves, how will using ATLAS.ti transform, resist, or frame the way that we do research? Second, adopting a digital workflow to support the kind of study that we want to do may actually require adjustments to how the technology itself is designed. That is, we can find that we actually can't do our study exactly like we normally would once we adopt ATLAS.ti. And we've seen over the years how software has continued to be redesigned and adapted to meet researcher needs. And we're going to talk about some of that today. Next, the third consequence category is around how adopting a digital workflow is going to impact the human relationships between the researchers and the researched. This category is often framed as ethics in research and methodological writing, but we argue it goes beyond this. There are political consequences to choosing to use ATLAS.ti. We know that if you choose to use qualitative data analysis in a study, this is going to include some people and exclude others. And finally, our fourth consequence category is that adopting a digital workflow is actually going to impact what the findings of the study look like. The way knowledge is produced, the types of outcomes that are possible, that will all change. How we carry out the methods, the tool itself, how it's used, the relationship between the humans, this is going to change the ultimate product of the study, both in terms of whose priorities are reflected and the cultural norms that are visible. And I'll just add that we used Whitaker and Atkinson's 2021 work as sort of a foundation of defining reflexivity methodologically, and we built on that as we attended to technological reflexivity and tried to extend their framework to some extent. So next, I'm going to hand it over to Jessica. This is the first of 4 workflow examples that we're going to kind of talk through to give you a sense of what we mean in terms of the importance of being reflexive around adopting various workflows for our research. Jessica?
Thanks, Trina. And so this first workflow is focused on adopting a paperless literature review workflow. And when we think about this question, we're really pushing ourselves to think through what are the consequences of adopting a paperless literature review workflow. And by consequences here, we're including both intended as well as unintended, positive and negative consequences. And we're also assuming that consequences exist, whether or not a researcher acknowledges their existence or not. So methodologically, without thinking about technology, much of the scholarly writing around literature reviews points to a range of phases that are part of a lit review. In our own most recent book, we write about this as including 4 phases: locating and evaluating literature sources, eventually going to store and organize those sources. Eventually, you'll move to reading and annotating, and then analyzing and synthesizing. And ATLAS.ti, of course, can be positioned, as Trina noted, as a hub, really to help us really think about how the literature review process might intersect with all of these phases. But even as a hub, we do know that there are usually other technological sources that we might have to leverage, such as Zotero. So for instance, when thinking about this first step, we may leverage Zotero as we begin to locate and evaluate and collate our literature sources. And these sources might eventually need to be digitized, but then we have to store them directly, hopefully, in the software as our primary hub. Not everyone will go elsewhere outside of ATLAS.ti to read and annotate, but some people might. So some people might leverage tools like Goodreader as a way to read and annotate in their first pass with their literature base. But then really, we argue that the power comes analytically when we begin to synthesize the literature review within the context of ATLAS.ti. So literature reviews, of course, many of us are familiar with it, are really not that dissimilar from a thematic analysis where we're coding and eventually thematizing the literature. And so ATLAS.ti really does serve as this powerful resource for us as we transition our literature into that space and begin to interrogate the literature base and pull relevant quotes, for instance, when writing up findings regarding our synthesis and analysis of the literature. But when doing all this, there are, of course, consequences that come along with the decisions we make related to generating our workflow. So some of these consequences include the potential that there might be impact on methods, which we have long argued that creating a workflow within ATLAS.ti really as this one-stop shop can lead to a more systematic analysis of the literature. And that's a really positive consequence on the methods of literature reviewing. Of course, another consequence that has received some attention has been that some scholars will need to, in some cases, radically adjust how they read. Reading paper-based literature versus digitally stored literature is a really different experience. And so there might be an impact on humans as they have to fully adjust to digital reading habits. And that could be a significant change to their workflow. And then finally, another consequence that is specific to the impact on technological design is really that when leveraging ATLAS.ti as part of your digital workflow for literature reviews, you may need to still move across multiple technological tools as you carry out your workflow. So, as you retrieve your data, store your data, and engage in an initial evaluation of your methods, you may, for instance, be working with Zotero or Goodreader, as I mentioned, and then transition to ATLAS.ti for more robust analysis of your literature database. Another impact from that's related to the technological design is that you will potentially have to use other tools to generate reference lists that might intersect with a range of writing software tools that might be specific to your individual process. So indeed, there are several consequences that are part of thinking through your digital workflow and might be experienced as it unfolds as well. So next, Trina will be talking a bit about social media as part of the data collection workflow. Trina.
Thanks, Jessica. So yes, our second example is thinking about consequences of integrating social media into a digital data collection workflow. One major consequence of social media coming on the scene is that suddenly we have, and we've had, of course, this has been around for a while, but we've had the possibility of working with much larger data sets that may be more difficult to access, and also a challenge for qualitative researchers who aren't used to working with such large data sets to figure out how to get a handle on integrating social media data into a qualitative research workflow. So what's happened is that new tools and new methods have had to be adapted, or the adaptation of existing tools we've needed to have those become part of our repertoire as we've moved into this world. So as an example, Lexamancer was developed in 2006 at the University of Queensland, and it positions itself as being able to conduct quantitative content analysis of social media data or other large data sets using machine learning techniques. As it describes itself, or I guess as its developers describe it, it learns what the main concepts are in a text, how they relate to each other, can conduct a thematic and relational or semantic analysis of even interview data. In this screenshot, you kind of see how a different kind of jargon and language is being developed around how text analysis and research is even described. Huge volumes of text, finding high-level concepts, uncovering stories that are hidden, and this notion of power, how powerful the tool and how powerful this data is for answering social science research questions. So one technological design consequence for researchers who have been wanting to adopt social media data workflows is that ATLAS.ti added the Twitter import feature some years back now in order to seamlessly offer us the ability to work with the data. However, as social media continues to evolve, or in the case of Twitter or X, devolve, the consequences are that the technology has to keep up. It also has to change. So in this case, a new button, social network comments, appeared into ATLAS.ti's interface. Because, as we can see here, when Twitter disabled the API, we were no longer able to use that feature of the software. So what happened here is that it required another digital tool to be added to this workflow, exportcomments.com. So Atlas was scaffolding for us a workaround, and that made it possible for us to continue with this digital data collection workflow. However, there were consequences here as well. There was only exportcomments.com only offers a limited number of free comments before you have to pay, and the data is pulled out in the form of a spreadsheet, which can be fine, especially if you're doing kind of more quantitative work, but it does lose the threaded nature of the data, which has serious consequences for methods, language-based data analysis methods, such as what I use, like conversation or discourse analysis. So here we see how I've managed to kind of work with Instagram and Reddit data. I find myself reverting back to a very old school technology, which is to save the websites of Reddit as a PDF document, or cutting and pasting the social media posts and comments out of the website into Word documents. It's either do this old school workflow or invest resources into hiring a computer programmer who knows Python or R or another language that can help me extract and format data in a way that makes it possible to use language-based analysis methods because the threading is retained. So in this case, our digital workflows remain simple, at least mine does, in that the consequences for the human researchers, the consequences for the human, for me, would include the need to learn new methodological language, new programming skills, and new platforms. And so I'm still currently in this very old digital data collection workflow. So to summarize those just little anecdotes of creating some digital data collection workflows, large data sets do transform how we think of qualitative data and how to analyze it. As we've been presented with this great insight into the social world, it has impacted our methods. ATLAS.ti and other platforms are adapting to support the systematic capture, organization, and analysis of large data sets. So we do see, again, this impact on the technology design itself as different kinds of workflows are needed. And understanding new methods and new tools can be a challenge, but also an opportunity for researchers. So there's an impact on humans there as well. So that's our second example. And now I will turn it back to Jessica to look at some of what's been happening in the transcription workflow space.
So our third example focuses on the transcription workflow, and transcription practices certainly have begun and have really for some time to be impacted by a range of new technological developments. The use of AI to generate transcripts has really changed the landscape of transcription, raising questions that include what is the place of a human researcher in the transcription process? Moreover, the ability to directly code and analyze video and audio recordings is also impacting how we think about the consequences of adopting one transcription workflow over another. Questions at the core here include, do we even need to transcribe, given we can directly analyze our video and audio recordings? But regardless of all these questions, transcription is certainly a part of how we think about the qualitative research process. And so generating a transcription workflow is something that ATLAS.ti really does provide us with opportunity to think about how it might intersect with the generation of our workflow. So as we think about the place of ATLAS.ti in generating a transcription workflow, there are a range of features within Atlas that can support our thinking and generation of a transcription workflow. So for instance, ATLAS.ti has added some features specifically to better integrate with artificial intelligence, AI-generated transcripts, where you can import AI-generated transcripts that will include timestamps. It will also automatically generate speaker coding, or you can transcribe directly in ATLAS.ti. So you have a lot of different pathways to generate a transcription workflow that aligns with your research design and or your orientation to the transcription process. And then, of course, you can also choose to directly code your video or audio files. The next slide illustrates where ATLAS.ti can be a really useful tool for transcription workflows, as it allows for us to synchronize our transcripts with our recordings and or directly code media files. And this capacity to synchronize really allows us, as many qualitative researchers have argued, to stay really close to our data. Obviously, for many of us, it's a faster process to read a text-based transcript and slower to engage directly with our audio or video recordings. And the synchronized transcript provides us with this capacity to do both and not move so far away from the actual recorded event. So really providing opportunities for us to stay close to our data. The next image illustrates just one example of a transcription workflow. And this is an example that we write about in the recent paper that Trina mentioned earlier in the presentation. So in this example, first interviews were conducted and recorded in Zoom, and then the recordings were uploaded to Otter AI, which is an AI transcription system. And then eventually they were downloaded and imported to InkScribe, where synchronization took place. So the recordings were synchronized to the transcript within InkScribe, and then eventually we transitioned to ATLAS.ti for a more robust analysis. Of course, this workflow could look differently depending on the technologies that you have available to you and your own preferences for how to carry out the transcription process. So all of these decisions that you make around a transcription workflow, of course, have significant consequences. One of the consequences related to methods is that AI-generated transcriptions really do provide us with some efficiency, but also what they're providing us with is really a first pass AI-generated transcript. You still are going to be required as the human in the research process to go back and engage in greater detail in refining the transcript. Another important consequence is that whenever we upload data to the cloud for AI transcription, we of course open the door for a range of other privacy concerns. And of course, some kinds of qualitative data are simply not allowed to be uploaded to the cloud. So these are important ethical considerations that certainly come into play in relationship to a transcription workflow. And then in addition to that, there is an impact on what counts as knowledge when we think about how these new technologies intersect with our transcription workflow. The data is no longer just the typed transcript, but the media file as well. And it opens up possibilities for us, as I noted, to stay really close to our data, as well as to really think differently about what might count as the knowledge that we center our analysis on. So the next example that we'll transition to is focused on creating data analysis workflows, and Trina will be walking us through this example.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. All right. So one consequence of adopting ATLAS.ti or any qualitative data analysis software as part of your data analysis workflow, or even just as your hub for your entire research process, is that for years, until recently, choosing to use QDA software actually made it more difficult to collaborate because unless all of your members of your research team had the same software and were able to save project files and share them asynchronously, for many years, there was no way to easily share data or to synchronously log into the data to do the work together. Now, this has changed recently. Web-based tools were developed, Deduce, for example, and then, of course, ATLAS.ti Web. And especially what really changed the landscape here was the Rotterdam Exchange Format Initiative, where the QDA exchange format the XML exchange format was developed. So that if you do work in ATLAS.ti, you can actually share that with somebody who's using in vivo. And those retrofitting or redesign of the tools, or introducing, if you want to frame it as introducing the new web-based version of the tools, that really changed the landscape because it allowed us to actually do work collaboratively in a way that we were not able to do for years. So that's another example of how creating a digital workflow ended up eventually impacting the technological design as researchers made clear their need to be able to collaborate in a smoother process. A more recent consequence, as OpenAI models are being integrated into tools like ATLAS.ti, are new concerns around protecting data and the privacy of participants. And of course, this was true too as we move to web-based tools, that we are actually putting data in the cloud, and we have to think about that. So while AI has been around for a while, for most of the qualitative data analysis software packages, and also for ATLAS.ti, such as some of the auto transcription integration that Jessica mentioned, and also the word clouds, the text searching and auto coding, the concept identification, the sentiment analysis. These new tools and the integration now with AI, OpenAI, make these consequences for humans even more apparent, even more relevant, and kind of coming to the forefront. And so here we see some of the ways that the company is reassuring us about exactly how our data is or is not being used as we move into this age of integrating with OpenAI. There are also consequences for methods in terms of what data analysis looks like and what knowledge outcomes and what the product of our work is going to look like. I'm sure I'm not the only one who sees just what huge implications this latest development is going to have for us as researchers. So what I'm going to show you now, this is an organized coding scheme for a manual, like a just traditional ATLAS.ti analysis that a colleague and I did. We were looking at 23 interview transcripts. We did interviews for a study with women who are highly successful executives in upper level leadership positions in a variety of fields, but who also identify as introverts. We've been doing a phenomenological study of what their experiences were like. And so here you're going to see some code groups on the left. And you'll see one code category there that says ignore for now. So those are some codes that we decided we're not looking at currently. And you see at the top of the coding framework, there's some survey question codes there too, which have been separated out. But the remaining codes have been organized in order to answer the research questions, which is what is the experience of these women who identify as introverts and are also highly successful leaders. So you'll see here that our top findings, or our most frequently used codes, were around things like they described the networking requirements, the social obligations of their jobs to be very difficult. They noted that they have a very unique approach to work. They prefer to work behind the scenes. They have a certain relationship to how much energy they're able to expend and how they cope around that. And keep an eye on the codes that have the green bracket drawn around them, because I'm going to come back to those. So some other things that we found in the manual coding, again, informed very clearly by the research question, are that mentoring was a big part of their life. They did realize that a lot of colleagues have misconceptions about what introversion actually is. They mentioned a lot of characteristics and strengths they have, how they feel they have being introverts. And also they talked a bit about what their relationship is with the idea that leaders must be extroverts. So after our human coding, we decided to test out what some of the OpenAI tools would do with the same data. And these green brackets were really the most overlap that we found with the OpenAI results. So the first thing that you might notice is that it created 1,771 codes across 1,624 quotations, which is a lot. It's a little bit reminiscent of what Susanna Fries used to call the coding swamp. The red brackets kind of show codes that are really just capturing the topic of the study, rather than findings related to the actual experiences. So, introversion, leadership, and gender were the topics of the interviews. We noticed too that the blue brackets, uncertainty, self-doubt, social anxiety, a high emphasis on extroversion, seem to be skewed or framed. They were coded frequently, but also kind of picked up on the negative aspect of that. But the green were the more overlap with the codes that we also found: self-reflection, empathy, reflection overall. So methodologically, it could be useful for some analysts who might prefer this big picture view of coding almost everything, and then the humans can go in and modify, merge, or delete what isn't relevant and then go there. Other people may decide that they want to go in first as humans and then compare what we noticed with what the AI may have found that we did not see. As Christina Silver has noted in webinars and discussions that we've had around these AI tools, it's an interpretive dance of AI and human coding. And it would be really great if we could have some technological redesign where we could adjust the unit of analysis and target the analysis based on particular methodologies or research questions, so that the codes and the outcomes that we get is actually more targeted to the research questions that we have. So traditionally, once you have your codes in place, we would run a code report, read through it, and start crafting paragraphs that capture the findings and kind of move from codes to themes and really start to write that up. So we also played around with the AI summary tool, because with this tool, we can ask it to summarize all of the quotations that have been coded with a certain code. And as it turns out, that does a very quick and interesting job of writing a paragraph that you can then compare its summary. And so for this one, we were asking it to summarize the code category that social events and networking is difficult for introverts. And so here is its paragraph which I find hilarious that it starts out TLDR, too long, didn't read. I love whoever programmed that into the tool. And then it does seem to think that it's summarizing one person's quotations when really this is a summary across all of the interview data, but that's just I'm sure just a glitch in the programming. But this is a methodological consequence that you have a partner to help with the analysis, that after you've summarized it yourself, you look at the summary that AI produces or vice versa, but you do have another round of analysis. And this is really a methodological consequence in how we're going to be using these tools in our analysis. So there is research coming out where people are starting to compare analysis with and without, in this case, ChatGPT. We would argue that framing the differences around the 4 consequence categories might be more helpful than just, or it might be helpful to add into this discussion around what happens when we use these tools. I think that it's a really good place to really think about that. So in terms of the data analysis, using ATLAS.ti as a team required cloud-based platforms and exchange formats to be developed. So that was my first example of the impact of using a digital data analysis workflow, and it's what happened with the technology itself. Uploading data to OpenAI does raise some data privacy concerns, similar as with the transcription workflows, the impact on humans. And AI coding and AI summaries alongside human analysts can create, as Christina Silver called it, an interpretive dance where there is this impact on methods and also on knowledge outcomes that's really going to affect all of us as qualitative researchers as these tools change, become more powerful, and are adopted in different ways. So in summary, technology reflexivity or technological reflexivity means considering intended and unintended positive and negative consequences of adopting digital research workflows. There are 4 potential consequence categories that we have theorized so far, and we welcome feedback, comments, and ideas on this. Impact on the methods, impact on the relationships and the humans involved, impact on the knowledge production and outcomes, and impact on the design of the technology. So creating a coherent, methodologically sound research design requires attending to these technological consequences and hopefully making them very visible in our research reports, in how we talk about research design, so that they're open for interrogation, and that hopefully we can create more equitable, just, and robust research designs. And that wraps up what we have to share, and we look forward to discussion, comments, questions. Roel, would you like me to stop sharing?
Why don't we see everybody? So go ahead and let's do that. And if you want, please feel free to send Trina and Jessica a reaction by clicking on the smiley face. And I want to thank both of you for presenting today. I will be fielding questions for Trina and Jessica, please feel free to fill in your question in the Q&A button using that question mark icon on the Zoho toolbar. In the meantime, while we're a couple of notes just to and I have some questions of my own, but a couple of notes that if you have any suggestions for future webinars from IQRN or ATLAS.ti, please feel free to send us an email at training@atlas.ti.com, and we're always happy to field suggestions about what's your qualitative needs and how can we help support your qualitative research, and what education can we provide in that respect. Our next webinar for IQRN is coming up in November on focus group data analysis, visualization, and reporting using ATLAS.ti. All IQRN webinars are you can sign up for free, and so please feel free to visit the IQRN website or the ATLAS.ti website to sign up. While we're waiting for questions, I have a couple of my own. Maybe I'll start with a broad one, and then I have a couple of specific ones. But this discussion about the use of AI-assisted tools in ATLAS.ti or any QDA package that now uses AI, it definitely emphasizes the need to reconsider consequences about what technological choices we make. However, that also gets me thinking about my PhD days when I have a very loving advisor. Let me just who really wanted to get us to conducting coding, data organization, data analysis in an analog fashion, and use of statistics was very risk creating a positivist view of the data, and I think one more critique I had in my defense was the use of these statistics seems like it's now your study is more of a mixed method study, which I took it to mean as kind of a four-letter word. I don't know if it was meant that way. That's just how it was, and but that gets me thinking as one more word I'll insert is as I've become more of a post-structuralist in my career, I wondered to myself, like, is going analog, not having tech, really that much more authentic in terms of qualitative data analysis? And so while it's important to think of the use of tech as being consequential to how we look at the data, my feeling is it doesn't need to be looked at negatively, as in, oh, we must go analog in order to get to the heart of what the data means. And so I'm just wondering where both of you fit on that spectrum.
No, you do not have to go analog, especially since everything is already being collected digitally. It does. I mean, we use, it's some of our, like we mentioned early, our early work like 10 years ago was all about trying to convince people to use technology. And then I think we realized that either they are or they aren't. But as the newer generations come up, they're already using technology for everything. And it was my students years ago were like, why aren't we learning ATLAS.ti? What's the deal? There's this great tool out there. Why are we students doing this by hand? And so that's what got me to start using it. And yeah, there's some really old school, I guess, purists who seem to think that analog adds value. And maybe it does for your method. If you're doing an arts-based method, I could see that. Again, it's all about, is there a methodologically coherent reason why you're creating the workflow that you are creating, whether it's analog workflow, digital workflow. But as long as you have a good methodological rationale and you've thought through the consequences, I think that's kind of our argument. I think what troubles me is the absolute stance that you must not use it or you must use it. And there are people on both sides out there. Jessica, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's one that I feel will never go away. It seems like it's always with us in the qualitative community. I mean, my general answer to it is always that also is a technology. I mean, there's different types of technologies that we've always been using, and we just pretend that some is technological and the other stuff isn't. But thinking about analoging, that's just a different kind of technology that's being used. So there are consequences to those decisions as well. And I think at the core, we just want to be methodologically driven. Our methods should drive these decisions that we're making, and understand that the decisions we make are also going to feed back to the methods and shape the methods. That it's really, we're co-researchers with ATLAS.ti, or a different kind of orientation we might be taking to engaging with technologies.
Yeah, I think that, I think that aligns with where I am, and just trying to be methodologically consistent is far more important than what tools you use. And of course, some tools are easier than others, or create more capability than others. But it is about being methodologically transparent and consistent, which gets me to the next general question. As we talk about, I get the sense that the use of AI tools in QDA, let alone wherever else, it's going to look very different next year than it does now, as it did last year. And I'm wondering, if we're talking about methodological consistency or transparency, one of the areas that you mentioned is about transcripts, and being able to, and the need to review the automated transcripts that are generated by services like Otter or InkScribe. And for everyone in the crowd, InkScribe, INQ Scribe, that logo threw me off earlier. But the need to review transcripts that are created by AI, is there going to be a need for any established standards among us qualitative researchers for data, for rigorously reviewed transcription?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I can start us off and then pass it off to Trina. Yeah, I mean, I think AI is obviously not going to just impact transcription, but perhaps because that one's been with us a little bit longer, we're maybe more comfortable thinking around it, because many of us have actually leveraged AI for producing these first pass transcripts, and it doesn't feel quite as wow as when we're passing off data for a basic thematic analysis with AI. I do think it's important to think about what are our quality practices, because we know that producing a transcript, a quality transcript, shapes our findings. And so there's certainly, I think we're going to need to certainly come back to discussions around quality. Some people talk about, this as validity, as we intersect with technologies and kind of innovation that's pushing those technologies forward in ways that maybe many of us didn't imagine would be part of our work as qualitative inquirers. I also think another important question that is going to be important for us in the coming decade around transcription is, do we need to do transcription in the same way that we have been doing it? Like AI, yeah, but do we really, particularly those of us that work with large video recorded data sets, do we really need to be doing transcription, and how will that impact the methodological claims that we historically have made about transcription? I know, because there's this long-standing stance that we are the instrument in the research process. It feels scary to even say that question, but I do think it's a question that's worth our community wrestling with, as we think about how ATLAS.ti really has created new possibilities for us to even ask that question. When we're working with large recorded data sets, do we even need to access AI transcriptions? What is the methodological reason we're doing this, other than a historical artifact of saying we followed someone's rules? And so I think yes, AI does raise questions around concerns related to quality and kind of community-generated standards related to that, as well as just thinking about how new technologies might put into question the need for mass production of transcripts for qualitative inquirers. Trina?
I'll just mention that your question reminded me of something Christina Silver talked about in her webinar about AI tools, where she talked about the ultimate deep fake of what might be coming maybe without these methodologically or community standards around cross-checking and rigor, because you can basically do a literature review with ChatGPT, right? That may or may not, who knows. You can collect data and have it automatically transcribed with, AI. You can now do AI coding, and then you can have ChatGPT write your findings. And if there's no human checking of any of that along the way, how will we know or not? Now, right now, I think we would know. But as you mentioned, these tools are going to only get better, and they're going to start to look different. And so how do we come together to prevent this sort of deep fake research findings where people are somebody's becoming very savvy with integrating AI workflow that's completely AI driven, but without the human sort of check or review as to what we would call accuracy or validity? These are the things that make me really wonder. I would say very concerned, but I'm old, so it is concerning, and it will be really interesting to see how it all plays out.
Sure. And I think getting, the discussions about I don't know if they call it plagiarism, but the idea of AI generated scholarship is going to be is going to transform our field. It's going to transform the academy in the next decade. But the one thing that Jessica brings up, and I think I want to explore a little bit more, is the idea of questioning whether or not we need transcripts, AI transcripts, and this echoes something that I think was mentioned earlier in the webinar in this webinar about what is it? Conducting a literature review that is not necessarily text-based in nature. There's like other forms, and I wanted to get a sense of that because in my corner of academia, it still seems to me that we're still addicted to the written form. And as you talk about AI generated research, ChatGPT at this point still just perpetuates the written word. In terms of creating this paper, adding it to the publishing mill, and getting it published, etc., and encouraging more citations, etc. So I feel like there have been some initial attempts in the last 10 years to get at non-text-based research that can be used for dissemination, but none have really stuck, at least in my perception. But I want to get your sense of that, if you have explored that angle.
And when you're saying non-text, are you specifically referring to literature reviews or just in general?
I mean, when you say non, correct me if I'm wrong. I think I heard in the webinar about in this presentation about literature reviews that may not be text-based in nature, and that sounded like you might rely on sources that are not text-based, unless I misunderstood that part.
I don't, Trina, correct me if you think our writing has pointed. We've generally pointed mostly to kind of traditional notions of textual-based literature reviews. With that said, I mean, there has been some good writing, particularly in the humanities, around thinking about what counts as scholarly evidence.
Sure.
And I do think, as your point is highlighting, it does explode the notion of, should we just be relying on siloed, traditional, text-based literature to tell us what the state of the art of any phenomenon is? And the great thing about, QDA software is that it does afford us the opportunity to pull in other kinds of data, be it, blogs or video-based data, or, if people are doing literature production in the context of TikTok. I mean, there's lots of different ways we can think about building a literature database in a more kind of holistic way versus a siloed, purely traditionally defined academic way. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah. No, I think that addresses the fundamental assumption that I had being corrected, but then that also goes to the first question, to the going back to the idea of, do we need transcripts or do we need AI transcripts? And the only answer in my head is, well, we're still, as we write research, we're still addicted to the written word. And so that kind of still makes us incumbent on transcribing our data, in which unless new technologies are going to change that orientation.
Mm. Yeah,
I like this question.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to add that I was just going to add that I like this question because we talk a lot about new ways, innovative ways to represent findings. We did not include a representation or writing workflow in this presentation, but we have in other presentations, that to reach new audiences, we have to do more than just do a peer-reviewed journal article or a book, because the world has moved on from text, right? Almost all major social media platforms are very image and video based. And so how can we start to represent findings in new ways? But if we're going to argue that, then we have to figure out how we're going to incorporate those new ways of representing findings back into the literature review, unless we're going to claim that everybody has to do both, publish a text-based piece and represent findings in innovative ways that are only for practitioners or non-traditional audiences. And I don't know if there is searchable, like the technology that we really need is searchable video, searchable audio, because of course the strength of text-based is that you can search, you can read faster than you can watch, or that you can listen. So there are real practical reasons, but I do think, Jessica, are there already tools out there where you can do searchable video?
I'm not sure. I haven't heard of any. I would imagine there
needs to be.
Yeah.
And I interrupted you, Jessica. Go ahead. You're going to add something too.
I don't remember. So I'm glad you interrupted.
No problem. And then maybe one more question. Well, we're getting close to the top of the hour, and so maybe one or two more questions. I'd like to get, if this has already been addressed, forgive me, but I'd like to get a sense of what sparked the need for a discussion on technological reflexivity. Is there an observation that researchers are just, actually, no, without making any characterizations, but I wanted to see what the motivation of this discussion comes from.
It comes from our observation. So we've been working in this area, I don't know, 10 or 15 years now. And while reflexivity is such a huge concern by qualitative researchers, people treat the technology choices as if they're neutral. They either avoid them or absolute. They either avoid them completely or they adopt them completely without really thinking about the consequences. And that happened a lot during COVID. And so probably it was the pandemic when everybody had to go digital suddenly, if they hadn't already. But there was very little discussion around the impact of moving an interview to something like this, when a lot of assumptions around people's ability levels on everything from physical ability to attention ability to technology ability. So we kept seeing and experiencing, students, colleagues, participants, our own, we saw this happening. And because the book had just come out and we kept talking about theories of technology and methodological alignment. It was kind of an aha moment. And Jessica, I don't know, maybe you remember the aha moment better than I do, that nobody's been writing about, at least in the qualitative research literature, we don't see anything about technological reflexivity, even though they write about it in some other fields. And so we felt this was a good opportune time, when so many people now have experience with it, to think about what happens when we do this and not just assume that it's a neutral decision with no consequences.
Yeah, and I think for us also, our first book, we in many ways fell into that trap as well. Our first book around the use of digital tools across the qualitative research process, we were really promoting the idea of just use the tools and don't be frightened to use digital tools and navigate digital spaces in your qualitative research process. And in many ways, that argument was one that didn't attend to reflexivity as related to technological choices. I mean, we promoted the idea of being reflexive as qualitative researchers, using tools to support your reflexivity, but not also adding in the layer of these choices around technological tools also require a layering of reflexivity related to the consequences of their use. And so as we gained more feedback across the years and presenting our ideas and sharing it with the broader qualitative community, that feedback has certainly shaped and pushed us to think about the ways in which we can be really intentional in engaging with technological reflexivity.
I do like that word, intentional. We'll always want to be deliberate. My advisor always said we are the most important research instrument in our study. So it really is important to think through every one of our choices, in whether it's technology or otherwise. So in that case, we are at the top of the hour, and I want to respect both of your time. And this has been a wonderful discussion about technological reflexivity and qualitative research in general. Hopefully, this has been useful to all of our attendees and to all of you who are watching on YouTube or in the archives of IQRN. We do have our next webinar coming up in November. For more information, please search the IQRN website or the ATLAS.ti website for free registration and all of our trainings on the ATLAS.ti website. Please feel free to join in then. For IQRN and ATLAS.ti, my name is Roel Seibing. I want to thank Trina Paulus and Jessica Nina Lester for their time and their thought-provoking discussion. We will see you at another IQRN webinar in the near future. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.